At 3:42 p.m. on September 9, 1943, a lookout on the bridge of the Italian battleship Roma looked up into the clear Mediterranean sky and saw a dot falling from a Dornier 217 bomber flying at 20,000 feet. He shouted the warning, "Bomb release." The captain Adon del Cima did exactly what every naval commander had been trained to do for 30 years. He ordered a hard starboard turn. The physics of aerial bombardment were absolute. Once a bomb leaves the plane, it is a slave to gravity and momentum. It falls in a parabolic arc. If the ship turns, the bomb misses. It is a mathematical certainty. Captain Del Cima watched the massive ship heel over, cutting a white wake through the Strait of Bonifacio. He waited for the splash of the bomb, landing harmlessly in the ocean where his ship used to be. But then the lookout screamed again. "The bomb is turning." Del Cima raised his binoculars. It was impossible. The falling black shape wasn't following a parabola. It had corrected its course. It was banking in the air, chasing the ship like a living predator. In the next 12 seconds, that single weapon would prove that the age of the battleship was over. It would prove that a 35,000-ton fortress of steel protected by 1,300 men and massive guns could be erased by a single man sitting 5 miles away, moving his thumb on a plastic stick. The weapon was the Ruhestahl SD-1400X, codenamed Fritz X. The Allies didn't know it existed. They didn't know that Nazi Germany had just invented the smart bomb. And they didn't know that the man responsible wasn't a general, but a frustrated aerodynamicist who had spent the last 5 years obsessing over the drag coefficient of gliders. Dr. Max Kramer was not a weapons designer by trade. He was a scientist at the German Research Institute for Aviation in Berlin. He was a man obsessed with airflow. In 1938, he wasn't trying to blow up ships. He was trying to figure out how to make airplanes stop tumbling when they stalled. He spent his days in wind tunnels, blowing smoke over curved wings, studying turbulence. The German Luftwaffe had a problem. They had excellent dive bombers like the Stuka, which were accurate but slow and vulnerable to gunfire. They had high-altitude bombers like the Heinkel, which were safe but terribly inaccurate. From 20,000 feet, hitting a moving ship with a gravity bomb was like trying to drop a marble into a teacup from a balcony while the teacup is sliding across the floor. The hit rate was less than 3%. The generals wanted a bigger bomb. Kramer knew that a bigger bomb just meant a bigger splash. The problem wasn't power, it was control. He looked at the problem through the lens of a glider pilot. He knew that a falling object has terminal velocity. A bomb dropped from 20,000 feet hits the speed of sound. At that speed, traditional flaps and rudders don't work. The air pressure is so high that if you try to turn a rudder, it will snap off or rip the tail of the bomb apart. Kramer's blue-collar breakthrough came from observing spoilers on glider wings. He realized he didn't need to force the bomb to turn, he just needed to disrupt the airflow on one side. If he extended a small metal spoiler into the airstream on the left side of the tail, it would create massive drag on that side. The bomb would pivot around that drag, changing direction. It was a subtle, elegant solution. It required almost no force to deploy, but at 600 miles per hour, the aerodynamic effect was violent. He built a prototype. He took a standard 3,000-pound armor-piercing bomb, the PC-1400, and fitted it with a new tail. The tail was a box kite design, a ring wing that stabilized the bomb. Inside the ring were 4 solenoid-operated spoilers. It looked like a piece of abstract art welded onto a weapon. When he showed it to the Luftwaffe in 1940, they were skeptical. They asked, "How do you control it?" Kramer held up a small box with a joystick. By radio, he said. The system Kramer developed was the Kahle-Strasberg radio link. This was the grandfather of every drone, JDAM, and cruise missile used today. But in 1940, it was witchcraft. The bombardier in the plane didn't just drop the bomb and pray. He had to fly the bomb. Here is the physics of the kill that the Allies couldn't comprehend. The Do-217 bomber would fly at 20,000 feet. The bombardier would release the Fritz X as the bomb fell. A bright flare ignited in its tail. This was crucial. Without the flare, the bombardier couldn't see the black bomb against the dark ocean. The bombardier sat in the glass nose of the plane, clutching a small control box called the Fuji 203 Kahle. It had a simple joystick. Push the stick right, a radio signal sends a pulse to the bomb. A solenoid clicks. The spoiler on the right side extends. Drag increases. The bomb veers right. Pull the stick back back, the bottom spoiler extends, the nose lifts, the bomb glides further. It sounds simple like a video game, but the physics were terrifyingly complex. The bomb accelerated from 0 to 700 miles per hour. The command delay was milliseconds, but the human reaction time was slow. The bombardier had to predict where the ship would be in 14 seconds. He had to lead the target. If the ship turned left, he had to tap the joystick left, steering the falling ton of explosives as if he were driving a car on an invisible, icy road. The Luftwaffe formed a secret unit KG-100 to test this weapon. They recruited the best bombardiers in Germany. These men didn't practice on targets, they practiced on geometry. They learned to visualize the parabolic curve and bend it. They realized they could correct a bomb's trajectory by up to 1,600 feet sideways and 5,000 feet in range. That meant they didn't need to be perfect. They just needed to be close, and then they could drive the bomb into the ship's smokestack. By September 1943, the war had turned against Italy. Mussolini was deposed. The new Italian government secretly negotiated a surrender to the Allies. Part of the deal was that the massive Italian fleet would sail from La Spezia to Malta and hand themselves over to the British. The jewel of this fleet was the Roma. She was brand new, commissioned only 15 months earlier. She was 46,000 tons of displacement, armed with 9 15-inch guns. Her belt armor was 14 inches thick. She was considered unsinkable by conventional air attack. She was the pride of Admiral Carlo Bergamini. On September 8th, the armistice was announced. The Germans were furious. Their ally had just quit. The Luftwaffe was ordered to execute Operation H, the disarmament of Italian forces. But for the fleet, the order was simpler: do not let them reach Malta. Sink them. On the morning of September 9th, the Roma led a column of 23 ships down the west coast of Corsica. Admiral Bergamini believed he was safe. The Allies wouldn't attack him because he was surrendering. The Germans, he thought, were too busy fighting in Salerno to worry about ships at sea. He kept his anti-aircraft guns manned, but he didn't zigzag. He was steaming in a straight line, majestic and defiant. High above, Major Bernhard Jope of KG-100 was tracking the wake of the battleship. He wasn't flying a Stuka. He was flying a Do-217, a heavy bomber modified to carry Kramer's heavy baby. Jope signaled his flight. Target acquired. Prepare for release. The first bomb dropped at 3:30 p.m. It wasn't aimed at the Roma, it was aimed at her sister ship, the Italia. The bombardier Feldwebel Schmetz tapped his joystick. The flare burned bright orange. The crew on the Italia saw it coming. They turned hard. The bomb missed the stern by 50 yards, but this miss was terrifying. The bomb didn't detonate on the surface. It kept going. The fuse was a delayed action thalacid fuse designed to explode after penetration. The bomb dove underwater and exploded alongside the rudder. The shockwave jammed the Italia's rudder. The ship was momentarily crippled. The Italians were confused. Why did the bomb wait to explode? Why did it turn? Then came the second wave. At 3:42 p.m., the target was the Roma. The bombardier on the lead plane was Oberleutnant Heinrich Schmetz. He looked through his Lot 7 bomb sight. He saw the massive gray shape of the battleship. He released. On the Roma, Captain Del Cima ordered the starboard turn. The ship began to swing, but 20,000 feet above, Schmetz watched the ship turn. He moved his thumb. Click, click. The spoilers on the bomb's tail fluttered. The drag pulled the nose right. The bomb corrected. It stopped falling straight and started falling toward the turning ship. The bomb struck the Roma amidships between the rear gun turrets. This is where the physics of penetration becomes horrifying. The Fritz X was an armor-piercing bomb. It had a hardened steel nose cone. It hit the deck at 670 miles per hour. The Roma's deck armor was designed to stop shells, not a 3,000-pound dart moving at Mach 0.9. The bomb punched through the teak deck. It punched through the anti-aircraft deck. It punched through the armored belt. It traveled all the way through the ship, exiting the bottom of the hull, and exploded in the water underneath the keel. The explosion broke the ship's back. The boiler rooms flooded instantly. The rear engines failed. The Roma slowed to 10 knots. She was limping. Smoke poured from her funnels. Admiral Bergamini tried to regain control. Report damage, he shouted, but the internal communications were dead. The shockwave had shattered the vacuum tubes in the radios. The crew thought they had survived. They thought the bomb had passed through, but they didn't know that Major Jope had another plane behind him. And this time the bombardier wasn't aiming for the hull. He was aiming for the magazines. The second Fritz X began its dive. The bombardier adjusted the trajectory slightly to the left, lining up the glowing tail flare with the massive forward gun turrets of the crippled ship. At 3:52 p.m., the bomb struck the Roma on the starboard side directly between the number 2 turret and the command bridge. This time the bomb didn't pass through. It detonated deep inside the forward engine room directly adjacent to the main artillery magazines. What happened next was a physics event usually reserved for volcanoes. The explosion ignited the magazine. 700 tons of high explosive propellant cordite used to fire the massive 15-inch shells caught fire in 4 milliseconds. The pressure inside the hull spiked to levels that steel cannot contain. The resulting fireball wasn't just an explosion, it was an ejection event. The number 2 gun turret, a structure of solid steel weighing 1,500 tons, the weight of a destroyer, was blown cleanly out of the ship. It flew hundreds of feet into the air, spinning like a tossed coin before crashing into the sea. The command bridge where Admiral Bergamini and his staff were standing was incinerated instantly. The heat was so intense it melted the glass in the portholes. The Roma, the most modern battleship in the world, snapped in half. The bow listed to starboard, the stern listed to port, and the midsection simply vaporized. In 19 minutes she was gone. She took 1,393 men to the bottom, including the admiral. The sea was covered in a thick layer of burning oil and the debris of a naval era that had just ended. The news of the Roma's destruction reached the Allied High Command like a thunderclap. General Eisenhower and Admiral Cunningham were stunned. They assumed the Roma had hit a mine or been torpedoed by a submarine pack. When intelligence reports revealed it was a single bomb dropped from high altitude, the blood drained from their faces. If the Germans could hit a moving battleship from 20,000 feet, then the entire Allied fleet supporting the invasion of Salerno was a sitting duck. The invasion fleet was packed tight in the bay. Cruisers, destroyers, and transport ships were anchored unloading troops. They were perfect targets for Max Kramer's Joystick. 2 days later, the Luftwaffe arrived at Salerno. They ignored the small ships and targeted the cruisers. The USS Savannah, a Brooklyn-class light cruiser, was providing fire support for the Marines. Her captain looked up and saw the telltale smoke trail of a Dornier 217. He ordered evasive maneuvers, but the bomb followed him. The Fritz X struck the Savannah on the number 3 turret. The bomb punched through the turret roof, traveled down through 3 decks, and exploded in the lower ammunition handling room. The blast blew a hole in the bottom of the ship. Water rushed in. For 30 minutes, the Savannah hung on the edge of sinking. Her crew managed to seal the bulkheads, but 197 American sailors died in the blast. Then the HMS Warspite, the legendary British battleship, was hit. Then the cruiser HMS Uganda. The Allied fleet was being picked off one by an enemy they couldn't see and couldn't shoot down. The anti-aircraft guns couldn't reach 20,000 feet. The fighter planes couldn't climb fast enough to catch the bombers before they dropped their payloads. The Allies were facing a technological surprise. This is where the blue-collar genius shifts sides. The British Admiralty realized they couldn't outshoot the Fritz X, they had to outthink it. They needed to jam the signal. They called on a group of radio engineers who weren't military men, they were the Boffin's civilian scientists who worked in dusty labs. The Allies recovered fragments of the radio receiver from a crashed German bomber. They analyzed the vacuum tubes. They discovered that the Fritz X operated on a specific frequency band, 48 to 50 megahertz. This was the Kael-Strasberg link. The solution wasn't a bigger gun, it was an electric shaver. The engineers realized that the German radio signal was a complex series of tones. If they could flood that frequency with noise static, the bomb would stop listening to the joystick. The first jamming attempts were crude. They rigged electric razors to amplifiers to create broadband static. It didn't work well enough. The German signal was too strong, so the US Navy hurried a new devastatingly simple device to the front, the Type 650 jammer. It was essentially a radio transmitter that screamed electronic garbage on the 48 megahertz band. But there was a catch. The operators had to wait until the bomb was dropped to turn it on. If they turned it on too early, the German pilot would realize he was being jammed and switch frequencies. They had to play a game of electronic chicken. The next time KG-100 flew over the Mediterranean, the bombardiers tapped their joysticks, but the bombs didn't respond. The spoilers fluttered wildly. The bombs spiraled out of control, splashing harmlessly into the sea miles from the ships. The German pilots checked their equipment. They thought it was a malfunction. They tried again. Same result. Max Kramer back in Berlin was furious. He tried to upgrade the system. He switched to wire-guided bombs which trailed miles of thin copper wire to receive signals that couldn't be jammed. But the wires were fragile and broke if the plane turned too hard. The moment of the joystick bomb was passing, but the damage was done. The Roma was at the bottom of the sea. The U.S. Navy had learned a terrifying lesson: air superiority doesn't just mean owning the sky, it means owning the electromagnetic spectrum. The Fritz X was the wake-up call that birthed the modern era of electronic warfare. It proved that a cheap radio receiver could kill a battleship, and a cheap radio jammer could kill the bomb. Max Kramer back in Berlin was furious, but the story of the Fritz X didn't end in 1943. By May 1945, the Third Reich had collapsed. The Thousand-Year Reich ended in rubble. As Allied troops swept across Germany, there was a secret war happening within the war. It wasn't about land, it was about brains. This was Operation Paperclip. The Americans and Soviets were in a desperate race to capture German scientists before the other side got them. U.S. intelligence officers found Dr. Max Kramer not in a prison cell but in his laboratory in the Bavarian Alps. He didn't have a weapon in his hand, he had blueprints. He had the schematics for the X for a wire-guided air-to-air missile, and the next generation of the Fritz X. The Americans didn't arrest him for the sinking of the Roma or the Savannah. They hired him. They packed up his wind tunnel data, his joystick controllers, and his prototypes. They shipped them to the Naval Air Development Center in Johnsville, Pennsylvania. The man who had designed the weapon that killed hundreds of American sailors was now on the U.S. Navy payroll. It was a cold, pragmatic calculation. The physics of the joystick were too valuable to lose. Using Kramer's research, the U.S. Navy developed the ASM-N2 BAT in 1945. It was the world's first fully active radar homing bomb. It looked suspiciously like a Fritz X, but instead of a joystick, it had a radar nose. It could see the target on its own. Then came the ATGM-12 bullpup in the 1950s. It was a joystick-guided missile. The pilot fired it and steered it visually exactly as the Germans had done in the Mediterranean. The technology Max Kramer developed in a wind tunnel in 1938 became the DNA of Western precision weaponry. Every modern smart bomb, from the Paveway laser-guided bombs dropped in Desert Storm to the JDAMs used today, traces its lineage back to the Fritz X. The tail fins that steer a JDAM are the direct descendants of Kramer's spoilers. The only difference is that today the joystick is a GPS satellite and the bombardier is a computer chip. But the aerodynamic principle remains unchanged. You don't aim the bomb, you fly it. For decades, the Roma lay undiscovered in the deep canyons of the Castel Sardo Gulf. She was a ghost ship. The Italian Navy searched for her, but the depth, nearly 4,000 feet, made it impossible. It wasn't until June 2012 that an underwater robot finally found her. The images were haunting. The ship is broken in two. The massive 15-inch gun turrets, which weighed 1,500 tons, are lying in the mud, blown clear of the hull. But the most terrifying detail is the damage to the midsection. The steel hull is twisted and shredded not by age, but by the violence of the magazine detonation. It is a forensic crime scene that proves the terrifying power of the Fritz X. The Roma was the last great battleship to be sunk in combat by a guided weapon. Her death marked the end of an era. For 400 years, naval power was measured in armor thickness and gun caliber. The bigger the ship, the safer it was. The Fritz X changed the math forever. It proved that a small, cheap, intelligent projectile could destroy the largest, most expensive capital ship. Armor was no longer a shield, it was just extra weight. Max Kramer lived out his life in the United States. He continued to work on aerodynamics, specifically on boundary layer control to reduce drag on submarines and aircraft. He died in 1986. He is rarely mentioned in history books. He is not a household name like Wernher von Braun, but his legacy is everywhere. Every time a news report shows a surgical strike hitting a specific window of a building, building that is Max Kramer's legacy. He took the luck out of bombing. He took warfare from the age of carpet bombing, where you leveled an entire city, to hit one factory, to the age of precision warfare. He was the blue-collar aerodynamicist who realized that gravity wasn't a law to be obeyed, it was a suggestion to be corrected. And with a simple plastic joystick, he broke the back of the Italian Navy and split the history of warfare in half.